Hey guys, I'm coming to you from beautiful Tokyo, Japan. I've got a really fun video for you today. With the resurgence and the popularity of compact point-and-shoot cameras, Jaron, Jordan, and myself decided to do a little bit of a challenge. We go on KH.com and we would each choose a reasonably priced compact camera, whatever we wanted to do, as long as we kept it about the same price range. And then we're gonna give you guys a little mini review and talk about why we chose it and what our experience was like with that camera. Now, for my trip here to Tokyo, Japan, I decided why not bring the Canon Powershot G5X. I remember selling this at the camera store and really loving a lot of the controls, but in a way it was a bit of an underappreciated camera. So I'm gonna start things off. I'm Chris Niccolls, and this is PetaPixel, and this is the Canon Powershot G5X.
When we came up with the idea for this episode of looking at some classic compact cameras we'd never tested before, we immediately knew the place to go was KEH.com. And you can check out our entire podcast and see the process and the debates of us picking which cameras to look at. But the thing that blew me away is we went in with a budget of around $700, and we could choose between an advanced point and shoot with an EVF, or an APS-C fixed lens camera with a really weird sensor, or a full frame point and shoot camera. There's all kinds of really cool options at KEH.com, and I definitely recommend heading over to their website and checking them out for yourself. And look, we made some mistakes. Some of these weren't the best cameras for us, and that's why we love that KEH also has a very generous return policy. So check them out yourself, head on over to KEH.com. There's a good reason that they're PetaPixel's official pre-owned camera gear partner.
So the Canon G5X came out in 2015 and it carried off of the very popular G7X. And I remember really selling this and enjoying it because it had a fantastic control structure. But even more importantly, it had this 2.36 million dot EVF, which I really appreciated having on such a compact camera. Now, yeah, that does kind of change the overall look of it. It's not as pocketable because it's got that big hump on top, but I still think it was worth it. But the other things I really like about this camera, lots of control dials, dedicated exposure compensation, dedicated mode control dial, customizable front ring here, and another command dial here in the front. And this vertically oriented dial was really easy to manipulate. I could then zoom the lens, which gave you roughly like a 24 to 120 millimeter full frame field of view equivalent. And it was an f1.8 to 2.8 lens. But it doesn't end there because I also get this fully articulating back panel. This is a full touchscreen interface, and this is a time when Canon really had a very intuitive control structure. So I could use the dials and controls, but I could also go here and change things like ISO and white balance really quickly. I also got a little pop-up electronic flash, which is super popular today, but looked terrible in my day. But if I didn't want to rely on this little pop-up flash, this even had a full hot shoe, which would work with all the Canon TTL flashes. I mean, it's really cool. But at the heart of this camera was also the key. We had a relatively large Type 1 20 megapixel backside illuminated CMOS sensor. This is the same kind of sensor you'd find in things like the Sony RX1 series, and it was really popular, and it actually did make a big difference compared to a lot of the lower megapixel, much smaller point-and-shoot sensors on the market. But this camera was not without its faults. So first of all, the lens. I love the range. It's really good for travel photography. I like the fairly bright aperture, and with that relatively large sensor, I can get some shallow depth of field shots. The main issue with it was some flare problems and some chromatic aberrations, which do take a little bit of image quality away. You'd lose contrast in bright sunny conditions if it hit the lens just right, and often you get color fringing, and if you get rid of it, you might lose some detail. The other issue is lackluster battery performance. I mean, lackluster is a very positive word. It was actually really garbage. It was terrible. It's like 200 shots max, and so that could really be a problem. You'd have to carry a spare or be okay with this very casual, quick shooting. But I feel like the Canon Powershot G5X just kind of went underappreciated in the market at the time. It was popular enough to support a second generation, the G5X version 2, but it just wasn't like insanely popular, and I don't know why. I think back in the day, because the lens was a little bit underperforming, people just kind of poo-pooed the camera. Although now, with the resurgence of the popularity of point-and-shoot cameras, I mean, everything's going up in price, including the original G5X. It still hasn't gotten out of control the way some of the other cameras have, but it's going up there. Let's keep in mind that you can still buy a G7X Mark II brand new today, and Canon just cannot seem to make enough of those. But a really nice popular camera, and I would argue that nowadays with point-and-shoots, users are looking for that kind of less than perfect aesthetic to the image quality. They don't mind a little bit of chromatic aberration or a little low contrast when you're shooting in sunny conditions. You're still going to get good detailed photos, and more importantly, the handling is fantastic. If you really need an EVF and you're willing to sacrifice some of the pocketability, I think this is a great choice, and I've really enjoyed it here in Tokyo. But this is not the only camera we're talking about. So next, let's go to Jordan. He's going to talk about the camera he chose.
All right, it's Jordan here now, and back when we were on the podcast trying to determine which compact camera we wanted, my biggest priority is I want something unlike any camera that I've ever used before, and that brought me to the Sigma Merrill DP1. And the reason I wanted to play with this is I've never actually shot pictures with a camera with a foveon sensor. So essentially what a foveon sensor does is record different layers of red, green, and blue color channels all stacked on a layer compared to your regular Bayer interpolation, which does actually reduce detail that's captured. So basically, with a foveon camera like this, what I'm doing is giving up a lot of high ISO performance in order to get really good detail at low ISO. So theoretically, this should be an absolutely banging landscape camera. So basically with the Sigma DP1 here, they call it a 45 megapixel camera, and that's because it has 3 layers of 15 megapixel sensors for red, green, and blue, and that's mated with this 19mm f2.8 lens. And Sigma actually sold this lens separately, and I owned it just a little under a decade ago. I used that lens all the time, and I was actually really impressed with it. But what I wanted to know is how it was going to perform when put on this very demanding sensor. When I selected the Merrill DP1, Chris was very quick to inform me I was going to have 2 major struggles. One is going to be the battery, and the other is the Sigma Photo Pro software. Now, the battery was definitely the case. When I first got this old camera, I was probably using the original battery, and I was getting about 20 shots to a charge on it. But fortunately, Wasabi still makes replacement batteries for this. I got a couple of fresh ones, and I'm getting about 50 shots to a battery. It's not great battery life, but at least now it's not absolutely aggravating. As far as the software, I was like, Chris, your fears are unfounded, because I remembered a news story from a while back where they said that DNG support had been added to Sigma cameras, but unfortunately that was for the really weird looking Quattro series of cameras, not the Merrill series, which is the one that I happen to have. So I was going to have to use Sigma Photo Professional software in order to process the RAWs from this camera. More on that in a little bit. Okay, so let's kick things off with the handling of this camera. And honestly, I really enjoyed the fact that you have very quick access to all of your main controls. This was actually a real reminder for me how needlessly complicated a lot of cameras have gotten recently. The big thing I was fighting against is the autofocus on this. A clear, contrasty subject would be right in front of me. I would try to focus on it and just get the red, we cannot focus, all the time. So basically I wound up using this as a manual focus camera, which actually wasn't that bad because we've got a really nice little manual focus ring right here and quick access to punch in, so it wasn't a problem at all. Actually, the most jarring thing using this camera was the write speeds. Even if I was using a very fast SD card and knowing that my battery life was really limited, I would often take a photo and then very quickly go to power the camera down. And you can see you would just wait and wait and wait for it to write that file to the card before it did eventually shut the camera down. And this process frustrated me every single time. But what I really wanted to know is the image quality going to live up to that foveon sensor legend? And honestly, looking at the image, in terms of resolution, absolutely. The image is incredibly detailed. And this lens, just like I remember, is actually an excellent performer. From center to the corner, we're getting lots and lots of detail in this. But remember, there is no stabilization on this, and the form factor makes it very easy to shake the camera. So I needed to use extremely fast shutter speeds if I was hand holding. And a lot of the time I wound up just putting the camera right on a tripod. But if I did put it on a tripod, you can compare the detail from the Sigma to the very recently released Ricoh GR4. You can see this ancient Sigma is giving us actually quite a bit more detail. In terms of image quality, there was one issue that I was not expecting, and that's that when I was setting up my landscape photos, I would constantly find my histogram was pushed right to both edges in both the shadows and the highlights. So it looked like this camera wasn't capturing very much dynamic range. Now, typically your histograms only relate to the JPEGs. So when firing up Sigma's Photo Pro software, I found there wasn't actually that much detail in my shadows, and my highlights were actually completely blown out. This camera just does not capture a ton of dynamic range. When I mentioned this to Chris, he said, well, what you can do is just use Sigma software, convert your files to a TIFF, and if you play with them in an editing system, I'm sure you'll find access to a lot more information. And when I brought those files into Capture One, here you can see I am recovering a tiny bit more detail, but not much. I mean, the dynamic range, even at base ISO on this, is really quite poor. Here you can see a dynamic range comparison with the shadows boosted on the Ricoh GR4 and with the Sigma, and you can see the modern sensor just has a lot more dynamic range. I did have fun using the Sigma DP1, but I was kind of expecting it to be this little pocket camera I would always have in my bag, so if I saw a nice landscape opportunity, I could pull this out and get a very detailed image. But honestly, I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of that foveon sharpness for the wider dynamic range that's available in more modern cameras right now. So I'm sorry, you will not be my everyday carry Sigma, but you know what? I had fun with this opportunity to finally play with a foveon camera.
Hey there, Jaron Schneider here, and I'm coming to you from vacation, which I think is the ideal place to talk about a camera like this. This is the Sony RX1, and I've been using it for the better part of 2 months now. And if there is a question of whether or not this has aged well since it came out over a decade ago, I think the answer is yes. Inside this camera is a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, which is very similar to a 24 megapixel full frame sensor we still see on the market today. It's not quite as advanced as those, but it's still a very nice full frame sensor that produces some lovely images. When comparing the sensor in the RX1 to cameras made today, I wouldn't say that it has gobs of dynamic range, but it does have plenty. You can make some really lovely images, and I didn't find myself too restricted in editing. The color reproduction in this I actually think is really nice. I find the blues look really lovely, greens look great. If there's a downside, it's that 24 megapixels isn't particularly high resolution these days. So yeah, it's enough for most use cases, but the amount that I can crop has been significantly reduced. I've been a bit spoiled by my X106. And that's actually a good segue to talk about this lens, because Sony originally made the RX1 to compete with cameras like the X100 series. And so this is a 35mm f2 lens, which is basically the same thing that we're seeing on Fujifilm's X100 series, except this is made for a larger full-frame sensor. This lens is great. Really sharp, focuses relatively quickly. I would say that focusing isn't this thing's strongest suit. It tends to pulse a little bit before it locks on, but it gets the job done. One of the things I really like about this lens is that it has a little clutch on here that lets you change to focusing from 0.3 meters to infinity to focusing from 0.2 to 0.35 meters. So you can get relatively close to a subject, and the defocused area just looks so lovely on shots like that. I think that the fall off is just beautiful. When I first picked this camera, Jordan was telling me that I should be prepared for the battery to not last very long, and I actually haven't found the battery to be that big of an issue, only because I've been so judicious with the on-off switch. You see, if I'm not actively taking a picture, this camera is off. And in that way, I haven't had a problem with it lasting all day. That said, I do know that it has a kind of a slow bleed, so even if this is off and sitting on my desk, if I come back a week later, the battery's going to be dead. And so I can't rely on that. I always have to charge it the day before I plan to go use it, just to make sure that it's topped up. I appreciate the pop-up flash, even though I don't use it all that often. I'm glad that it's there. I guess we can talk about the menu system. This uses Sony's older menu system, which is notoriously terrible. It's not fun to work through, and it's just a drag. Nothing is where you would think it would be. The thing is, after I set this up the first time, I have never really used the menu system again. So yeah, it's an annoying menu, but you only have to dig in there one time, and once you get all the settings the way you want them, you basically never back in there again. So it's got basically everything I'm looking for. It's compact, it's got a lovely lens, the focusing is perfectly reliable, the battery life's decent, it has a pop-up flash. I don't really care that the menu's bad. So all of that said, what are my thoughts on the RX1? Well, the thing is, for everything that it does well, I'm just not really enjoying using it. Sure, it takes great pictures, it's reliable, autofocus is good enough generally, but it doesn't make me feel anything. And these days, I kind of value that more than I used to. Kind of a lot. I think the reason I don't really like this camera comes down to the LCD. It's not very bright, so using it on a day like today, if I'm standing out in the sun, I cannot see what the screen is showing me. I have to guess. Yes, you can get an optical OVF. I just don't like it. I thought I was going to use it a lot more than I am, and yeah, it gives you a great field of view, but I hate what it does to the shape of the camera. It makes it essentially catch on everything. It's no longer really pocketable, and I find that it wants to fall off constantly. I thought I was going to use it all the time, but I basically never do now, and I leave it back in my office before I go anywhere. This rear LCD also doesn't articulate, so it's very difficult to use this to get any unusual angles. I sort of just have to guess, and it's not really fun to use. But I think I would forgive all of this if I felt like the LCD showed me pictures that actually made me feel something. So when I get these pictures out of this camera and into a computer, I think they look great. The raw files have plenty of range. It's fun to edit. I like the pictures it takes. But for some reason, looking at the pictures this takes on this LCD, they just look drab. Every time they look like essentially like snapshots. No matter what I take one, it just seems like, oh, okay, I guess that's just a picture. It doesn't make me feel anything, and so it doesn't make me want to take more pictures. And that's weird. I don't really know what it is about this LCD, but it's just not doing it for me, and it really drags the whole experience down. The thing is, all of the complaints I have about this camera were essentially complaints I would have had back in 2012. So not a lot has changed. But that means this camera is still totally viable these days. So if you don't care about the things that I happen to care about, well, this is a great camera still, and I can highly recommend it. I've had fun with it, and I love the pictures I've gotten. So that says something, doesn't it? I've hoped you enjoyed this video, and if you have, make sure you like and subscribe. Also, if you like conversations about photography, make sure you check out the PetaPixel podcast. It's available every week, new episodes on this channel, as well as all of your favorite podcasting apps. Also, you should consider a PetaPixel membership. $3 a month or $30 a year gets you no ads on the PetaPixel.com website. You get 5% off your orders at KEH, you get $15 to spend at the Moment store, and you get 25% off the PetaPixel merch store. On top of that, you get access to the JPEGs and RAWs from all of the lenses and cameras that Jordan and Chris test. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time with more on PetaPixel. Jesus, I'm sweating like a pig out there.